Welcome to part 3 of the M1 Pro, M1 Max multiple display test. For this one, I'll be covering Lightroom Classic. Link up to displays in multiple different scenarios on multiple different computers and see at which point does the program become unusable on the system. Let's find out together. This is Artist Right. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. If you have already watched part 1 and 2, I'll leave timestamp in the description below so you can jump to the overview and see the test result right away. If you haven't watched part 1 and 2 yet, I'll leave links to them up here and in the description below. At least watch part 1 because it will go over the intro and establish a baseline for the test that I am about to do in a little bit more detail and talk about different display connections along with showing you the result for Final Cut Pro, which is pretty much amazing in any type of display configuration. Part 2 covers Capture One, so if you use Capture One, definitely recommend checking that out. And now we are at part 3, which I will show you the display performance for Lightroom Classic in multiple display scenarios. Here are the test and reference system that I have. There are 3 of them: a base 14-inch MacBook Pro base processor, 32 gigabytes of memory, 2 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max 32 GPU. One of them has 32 gigabytes and the other one has 64 gigabytes of memory in the system. Throughout all these tests, none of these machines really kick on a fan noise. They may be running, but I couldn't hear them. So I'm going to say that they're not really running at all, or they're running really lightly that I can't even hear them in my test. This is drastically different than a 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro with the Intel processor, which the moment I start to do anything at all, the fan just starts to kick up really loudly right away. And as a bonus, if you stay to the end, I'll have that clip showing you how that computer, the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro, performs when we're running these tests in comparison to these new M1 Pro and M1 Max processor. Quickly going over scaling in macOS, one of the things that you're going to notice is that the display resolution, it pretty much doubles it on both the horizontal and the vertical axes. Therefore, it's like taking your display resolution, what you want to see it as, multiply by 4. So you're really pushing the GPU hard on the system. For instance, macOS kind of have a scaling equivalent, and when you choose any of these scale mode, you will see a warning that using scale resolution may affect performance. And the reason why is because, for instance, on the top scaling one that we have, 3360 by 1890, we're pushing the equivalent of 25.4 megapixels to each one of those displays 60 times per second. 60 times per second because most of the Pro displays refresh at 60 Hertz. If you have an even higher Hertz display, then it's pushing even more of that. So that's the reason why you may see some slowdown, and this will also be a good test. So for this, I'll be testing in 4K native and also the max scale resolution and see if there's any performance differences between the two. To quickly establish the display that I used in this test, all of them are 4K displays. I have the SL55, which is BenQ digital signage display, world first Pantone validated display. BenQ PD3220U, this is part of their Pro Designer Series display that has a Thunderbolt connection, and it is being daisy chained to the SW271C, which is a hardware calibrated display for photographers that can show 99% Adobe RGB, and also the SW271, which is the previous generation display, again 4K display, hardware calibration capable. For the testing method, if you already have seen the video, like I said, you can skip forward. But if you haven't yet, essentially what I am doing, it's not trying to mirror a real world scenario, but really push these computer hard. So I have both Chrome and Safari running, and each one of these browsers are running 2 separate windows. Each of these windows have 1 YouTube video playing and 3 tabs in the background. This could be apple.com, Engadget, Gizmodo, whatever that may be, The Verge. And I have all those running in the exact same way. So for each of these browsers, in total, there's 2 windows and 8 tabs running. And when you combine these 2 browsers, well, you're looking at 16 tabs total on the system. And we want to see how that loads the system in general. Throughout all these tests, I have Final Cut, Capture One, and Lightroom Classic running, and I didn't quit any of the programs. So this is also a multitasking test to see how far you can really push the system as well. And for this one, we'll be looking at Lightroom Classic, doing a few things. So I'll be editing and doing some localized adjustment on a 192 megapixel panorama to see if there's any slowdown in the brush when we start to use the display at different resolution. And you'll find some results that are rather interesting. And also work on a 36 megapixel from a Nikon D810 to see, once we edit this large file, Does the computer performance degrade at all when we go to a smaller file? Do we see any difference? So we're going to find a lot of interesting results from there. If you have already seen part 1 that establishes the test baseline, that's great. If not, I'll leave a link to that specific section up here. If you want to jump to that first, you can, and come back to this video. But for now, what we're going to do is look at Lightroom Classic, and you can feel free to pause this. Again, these are annotating based on the way how the program feels when I was really using them. These are not quite as scientific, but when I show you the result for these 5 tests, you're going to see the way how the computer does perform. And there are certain things that I want to just highlight and show. For example, a lot of times with Lightroom, I will show you usable, but there is some lag. So obviously when we run the display at scale resolution, when we have 2 display linked up to it, it is definitely going to affect the performance. And I am also showing you this cluster at the very end as well. So you can see the performance, what happens when you run 4K native versus when you run 4K scale. And lastly, if there's any difference between the 32 and 64 gigabyte model. So let's have a look at those. Base 14-inch MacBook Pro, 2 external 4K display at scale resolution, and this is going to be a dual screen edit. So all the Chrome and Safari tab and the video playing in the background has been aggregated to one screen. So 2 of these windows are Chrome, 2 are Safari. And what I have is Lightroom, Capture One, and along with Final Cut Pro running in dual screen mode. Let's see what happens. Starting with Lightroom Classic. Let's go in to dial things in up and down. There is a slight noticeable lag as I'm dialing things up and down. It refreshes on the internal laptop display first, and then it goes out to the external displays. Not quite the full instantaneous experience we were seeing before when we just run a single screen. Now let's do a sky selection. Subtracting with a brush auto mask and doing what we were doing before. So far, based on what I'm seeing, it's able to catch up. Initially, when you first start the stroke, there is a slight slowdown, meaning that as you can see, I'm moving. It takes a while for it to catch up, and then it's able to catch up. But during this time, there are no spinning beach balls or anything like that. And obviously, at this point in time, we have already been using even more swap on the system already. Jumping back into Lightroom, let's look at the Aurora Borealis photo. So if there's a slowdown in the panel, what about on just a single 36 megapixel file? Let's have a look. I noticed the slider jumping a little bit more. You can see as I'm adjusting this, it takes a quick moment for it to render on the external display. So some slowdown is happening already when we push the system this hard. And as I'm scrolling through this interface, there was a slight jump there, and we can see that the interface is jumping a little bit more. So this is getting to the point where we're really starting to push the program and the boundaries for what it really can do. Let's do a select sky. Let's do a brush and subtraction. Auto mask is still on. I'm going to try to focus on this area. And you can see that there are times where my brush already went ahead and the program is taking a moment to catch up. But once it has, it's pretty responsive so far. Not the worst experience, but I wouldn't say it is the smoothest experience using Lightroom at this point. Picking up where the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the base M1 Pro processor and 32 gigabytes of RAM is starting to show a slowdown is when we have 2 external 4K display linked up to the system and we run this at scale resolution. I have a 16-inch MacBook Pro. This is the one with the M1 Max processor, 32-core GPU, 32 gigabytes of memory, and right now we're connecting this to 2 external displays, 4K running at scale resolution. Let's see if this computer can handle that much better and to see if there are any slowdowns when we're trying to do this. Starting out with Lightroom and working on the panorama image. You can see that the previews are coming in fairly fast. There is a slight lag between the two. This is something that we expect to see when you're running this on multiple displays. Let's do a sky selection. And let's subtract using a brush. I'll zoom in. So far, there are no spinning beach ball. The brush is keeping up perfectly fine, although initially when I applied the brush the first time, as you see there, it takes just a few seconds for it to really catch up with what you're really drawing. And I think this just really shows us that, number one, Lightroom Classic does not really utilize the GPU fully yet, or the system resources really well at the moment, because it's not fully optimized, as you see there. I'll even just do in the sky here as I start to drag. It does take a quick moment for it to really catch up with what I'm doing with my brush stroke. But once that catches up, it's fairly smooth once you get it going. Let's now look at the 36 megapixel Aurora Borealis. Adjustments so far are happening okay. Interestingly enough, I start to see or feel that the interface is starting to lag, very similar to the 14-inch model. In some aspects. Yep, this is when it starts to struggle when we run at scale resolution. So now let's do a select sky. Subtract it with a brush, and let's try again. Very similar to the experience that I have before. Once you start the brush, it takes about a second or two to catch up, and it follows through just fine, but the overall interface is starting to slow down a little bit. 16-inch MacBook Pro, M1 Max, 32 GPU, 32 gigabytes of memory, 4 4K displays, all running at scale resolution, single screen edit. Starting with Lightroom Classic. Sliders and internal previews are fairly fast. Not a lot of slowdown I'm seeing. Let's do select sky. Preview for the sky is fairly fast even for this panorama. And let's do the subtraction with the brush tool. Auto mask is on. We'll have the overlay playing. So far, initially, there is a slight slowdown in the brush when you first click and move. However, if you just don't let go of the mouse or the pen and you keep moving along, it does follow through fairly quickly and relatively quick. So it's not too bad. And there's not too much lag going on right now. Let's have a look at the 36 megapixel Aurora Borealis. Adjustment in Lightroom, everything else is really smooth so far. Do select sky. And if we go and subtract with the brush, on this smaller 36 megapixel, there is no lag, no delay in the brush whatsoever. 16-inch M1 Max, 32 GPU, 32 gigabytes of memory, 4 4K displays, all running at scale resolution, and this is a dual screen edit. As I'm dialing up and down these sliders, there are slight glitches and jumping happening, meaning that the sliders are not quite as smooth as they were before, but we're really pushing the display hard at this point. Let's do a sky selection. There are some slight glitches every now and then, however, the change is happening fairly quickly once it really catches up to it, and the change reflecting in the internal and external display is pretty good. Let's do a subtraction with a brush. And let's see how the brush performs on a large file like this. So far so good. There are definitely lags, you can see that. For instance, I am clicking right now and I am dragging this out. It does take a moment for it to refine edge and everything, but considering that I can do it fairly quickly, it's not too bad. I mean, this is not really showing a spinning beach ball where the system is really locking up. It's just taking a little bit longer to do the decision making, refining the edge and everything. So this is 192 megapixel. Let's see how this performs on a 36 megapixel file. Because this is a smaller file, sliders still show a slight hesitation when I'm adjusting it, so it's not quite as smooth as I really want to, and it does bounce around a little bit. So when we really start to push the system this much, you're starting to see a performance degradation. Let's run and select sky. Subtract with a brush. And there was a delay with the brush. You can see initially there was a delay, and as I'm moving this around, it's not really quite catching up as fast as I wanted to. So yes, there is a delay with the brush, especially now that you're running on dual screen editing along with everything else going on with the computer. 16-inch M1 Max, 32 GPU, 64 gigabytes of memory, link up to 4 external 4K displays, all running at scale resolution. So as I go into dial Lightroom Classic on this top-end machine, it does take a little bit more time to render the changes on the external display, but there's no slowdown. This is really fast, and if we take a look at the memory usage right now, there is no swap whatsoever happening at the moment. Select sky. Adjustment to the sky are happening fairly quickly on the laptop. It takes a quick moment for it to update on the external display. And let's do a subtraction with a brush. So far, this is catching up with me just fine. There's no glitches or slowdown as I have observed in the 32 gigabyte model. The brush is really responsive. There may be a slight slowdown in the beginning, but it's extremely slight, and it's actually much faster than the 32 gigabyte M1 Max processor. Like I said, it takes a moment to catch up, but once it does, it is fairly responsive. This is a 192 megapixel file. Let's take a look at a 36 megapixel file and see if the performance would be any different. So the sliders are glitching a little bit right now when it's rendering. Let's see if it goes through any swap yet. No. I think this is just us pushing the display or the GPU a little bit hard. Let's go and do select sky. And we'll go through a subtraction with a brush. Auto mask is on. There is some slight slowdown in the beginning, as you see there, and it does take a moment to catch up. So It doesn't really respond 100%. For example, I was dragging over that area for a little moment now, and it did took just a little bit to catch up. So it is much more capable than the 32 gigabyte model, but I still think that when you're really loading things this much, you're really going to start to see a slowdown. Welcome back. So now you have seen Lightroom Classic performance. Overall, I think that if you really need to use that many displays, you're going to be okay. It's going to be laggy, but it's just a trade-off that you have to make. Most of us will probably be running on 2 external displays at the very most, even if you're a photographer. And I feel that, yes, there'll be some lag, especially if you're doing a mirroring on the second display, just to kind of show the edit and everything. But overall, the usability is not quite bad. It is still usable, but it's just something that you need to consider. And when you just really run it in one displays, it works better. Or the other thing is that if you have 4K displays linked up to your system, run them in 4K native. But here's a hint for you. For those of you that are just photographers and don't need 4K, get a 2K display, because on a 2K display, you won't be running into any of these lag issues that happen with a 4K display and a 4K with scaling. So just something to think about there. So what do I think about all of this? Well, these are extremely capable machines. The most impressive one, I've already mentioned this, is the base 14-inch MacBook Pro. But interestingly enough, you can configure a 14-inch MacBook Pro with the top M1 Max processor and literally link all these things up, as I have with this 16-inch model, and you can still put 64 gigabytes of memory in here. I mean, extremely capable machine. It just ultimately depends on what app you use, and I think that is the main thing that we need to consider between all these M1 Pro, M1 Max, 14, 16-inch. Think about the apps that you use. I've shown so many examples on my channel how each different apps perform. So for instance, if you're a photographer, you may not need, for instance, the M1 Max processor unless you're using Capture One. An M1 Pro may just work fine for what you really do, if you're, especially if you're using Adobe product. If you're doing video, M1 Max is definitely the way to go because of the double encoder decoder engine. And some of the samples in Final Cut Pro, you already saw that when I'm playing back the 5.9K footage, it's extremely smooth on here. And that's with all the display load. There's no drop frame whatsoever. And on my Mac Pro, just link up to 2 4K displays. Yes, I am running at scale resolution, but I can't set it on better quality. I have to set it on better performance. And when I play that back at double speed, it's just stutter. It drops frames. So extremely capable machine. The M1 Max also has the encoder decoder engine, double of them. So this machine, when I'm trying to export, for example, my previous calibration video, which is around 20 minutes long, this machine took around 7 minutes, where on my Mac Pro it took around 11 minutes. I mean, this machine, the one right here, this is the one with the 64 gigabytes memory, is around half the price of the Mac Pro. In fact, if you really take this machine at just the price it is, add the tax to it, it's pretty much actually, no, about a third the price of the Mac Pro. And it can already outperform it in so many tasks. So they're extremely capable machines. I think that they work well, but I hope that you're able to get some information about how the machine performs, how the display link up work, and you find this information useful. This is the last of the series. So this is part 3, and we have now reached the end. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, hit on the bell if you're new, and remember, in art we trust. And here's the bonus footage with the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. The test is done in the exact same way as the M1 Pro, M1 Max. This is the top machine, which is 2.8 gigahertz, 8-core i9 processor, 32 gigabytes of memory just dedicated to the CPU alone. It has an integrated graphic, but right now, because we're pushing this so hard, it is using the Radeon Pro 5500M with 8 gigabytes of memory just dedicated to the GPU. I have Lightroom Classic, Capture One, Final Cut Pro running, along with 2 browsers, as we have done in all the other tests. So Chrome and Safari actively playing videos, and it also has tabs in the background. In addition, both of these displays are 4K, but they're running at scale resolution at 3360 by 1890, so they are pushing around 25.4 megapixels, 60 times per second to each of these displays. And let's jump into Lightroom and see how this goes. we can see right away that the moment I start to drag these sliders, there is some stutter. For example, I'm trying to drag that there. It doesn't really follow through quite as quick. And there are some slight glitching going on. The display is updating on the internal laptop much faster than the external, but this is getting to the point where it's not really that usable. And this is a stark contrast to even just the base 14-inch with the M1 Pro processor that, yeah, it does become slightly unusable, but so far the program experience okay. Let's add in a sky selection. And one thing that we'll notice right away is that sky selection takes really long on these machines compared to the M1 Pro, M1 Max. Now let's do a subtraction with a brush. We'll zoom in on the side. And we can see that as I'm dragging the brush with AutoMask, it does take the computer some time for it to really respond and really show the reflection on the display. It's not that fast at all. The moment you have the brush going, there is stutter and lag. This is much more so than you observe with the 14 and 16-inch M1 Pro and also the M1 Max processor when linking up to an equivalent display, and the fan is going on like crazy at the moment. So let's have a look at the 36 megapixel Aurora Borealis photo and see if the result's any better for that. So it is a little bit smoother, although not so much because I'm dragging this right now. You can see that there is a definitive lag when I'm trying to do all these adjustments. And it does take a while to render on the external display. Let's quickly do a sky selection. This is going to take a moment. This fan is spinning really loudly now. You may be able to hear it from my microphone. Let's do a brush selection and we'll just have AutoMask on and I'll just try to paint the Aurora. So far, the initial brush is pretty good, but there is a lag, and if you keep holding down the mouse, it tends to just do just fine. But if you add on another point, there is a clear lag. For instance, I'll do that right now. Drag. That happens almost instantaneously. And it is a little bit better, but you can see that there are different moments where the brush would just lag on the system. So that's just something to think about, especially if you have these machines. Any of the newer ones is going to be much more capable than what these machines can do. And this was the top one back then.